We've all had traumatic plane experiences, but thankfully, most of us live to tell the tale of bad food, some turbulence, and Sam Jackson killing snakes while you're eating. Our experiences are rough, but some pilots get close to the danger zone. From an icy landing to a literal NYC miracle, here are the 15 most dangerous plane landings in the world. Number 15. An Antarctic landing. There are a handful of places where landing a plane seems like a terrible idea, and Antarctica is undoubtedly one of them. Even the most experienced pilots get queasy at the thought of landing a plane on sheer ice. Here's the view from the cockpit of AC-17 as it comes in for a landing on the ice runway near McMurdo Station. Even before the plane touches down on the ice, you can see just how frightening it would be. The runway isn't even visible for much of the approach. Amazingly, the pilots not only have to find the runway but also land a whole plane on it. The dangers of landing an aircraft on an ice runway are pretty apparent. Not only do you face the threat of potentially going through it, but you also have to somehow come to a stop, which is obviously incredibly awkward on the ice. I don't think a single pilot in the world would willingly volunteer to land a plane on an ice runway, but then again, Tom Cruise exists, so there's always an exception. Before we continue with this video, please smash the subscribe button and click the notification bell right now. Otherwise, this centipede will crawl on your face while you're sleeping. It's time for a rare topic, and dangerous may be an understatement for this one. This terrifying image was captured by a Spanish photographer who witnessed a plane approaching the bridge he was driving on. Despite the pilot's best efforts, the plane couldn't miss the bridge entirely, clipping its wing on the road as it passed before landing in the ocean. Miraculously, nobody died in this encounter. The plane landed in the sea, everybody got out, and those on the bridge were unharmed. What do you think? Was it a miracle or an illusion? Number 14. Miracle on the Hudson. I don't think I even have to set this one up right. We all know the incredible story behind Sully Sullenberger's heroic landing on New York City's Hudson River in 2009. But we're going to look at it anyway because we can see what makes a miracle on the Hudson so miraculous is the sheer impossibility of it. Many pilots have attempted to land in an open body of water, but almost all have failed. These are the first images of the plane in the water that Sully was able to land in a way that kept the aircraft in one piece and ensured that every person on board survived. That's unbelievably fortunate. It's no wonder he got a movie made about him and Tom Hanks playing him too. Is there any better compliment than to be played by the world's nicest guy? Probably, but I haven't heard it yet. The Hudson River incident is perhaps the most famous dangerous landing in recent memory. Those who saw the endless news coverage could probably accurately recall the whole thing. It's truly a modern miracle, and Sully himself is a hero. Number 13. A no-wheels landing. There are really only 3 things needed to land a plane: a pilot, brakes, and wheels. Unfortunately, a Boeing 767 making the journey from New York to Warsaw, Poland couldn't use its wheels. So, what do you do when you realize that the landing gear just isn't working? Captain Tedious Rona had no choice but to think on his feet. After circling the city for an hour and trying to resolve the problem, Rona concluded there was very little chance of landing safely. So, with 231 people on board, the plane came in for a landing despite having absolutely no landing gear. It's all very fast and furious, isn't it? As you can see from the video, the plane crashes in on its belly, sliding along the runway until it eventually grinds to a halt. Firefighters rush in to put out a small fire, but miraculously nobody was injured. It's genuinely a miracle. At the same time, Rona was later hailed as a hero and celebrated for his accomplishments. He insisted that he was no hero, believing that any good pilot would have done the same thing. Number 12. Aloha Airlines Flight 243. They always said it could only happen in the movies, but in 1988 a routine flight between Hilo and Honolulu suffered a severe explosive decompression while mid-flight. Despite the chaos and damage caused, a miracle was summoned. The plane managed to land after reaching an average flight altitude. A section of the plane's roof ruptured, ripping off a massive selection of the cockpit to the fore-wing area. That's 18.5 feet of airplane skin wholly gone. That, my friends, is an absolute nightmare for all of us. The incident caused one unfortunate fatality as a flight attendant was swept out of the plane. 8 others suffered severe injuries resulting from the incident, with 65 people reported injured. In total, 60 people were taken to the hospital, but most incredibly, all of these people survived the disastrous flight, which is incredible. Having never landed a plane myself, I can only imagine it's a tricky thing to do in ordinary situations. I can't even think of how difficult it would be when you are literally missing a massive part of your fuselage landing. This one is about as big a miracle as you could hope for. Number 11. Delta Flight 5176. If you fear flying, you no doubt feel a twinge of anxiety about the idea of flying in a storm. Thankfully, most pilots are trained well enough that nothing can stop them, not even unpredictable bolts of electricity strong enough to kill just about anybody. In May 2016, Delta Flight 5176 was preparing to come in for a landing in Omaha, Nebraska. Unfortunately, the flight was scheduled to land during a particularly violent storm, which is unfortunate for those scared of flying. Thunder isn't any more likely to cause trouble than rain or snow. It just looks a little more frightening, and when you have images like this, a lightning bolt barely missing the plane's wing, even ominous sounds like an understatement. Thankfully, the pilots were unfazed and continued their work as planned to come in for a successful landing with many relieved passengers. Landing a plane in a lightning storm isn't all that unusual or scary for pilots, but it certainly is dramatic. I doubt many of the passengers on board will forget this frankly terrifying experience. Number 10. Maho Beach Landing. The most dangerous airports in the world tend to be surrounded by environmental elements. For instance, Maho Public Beach is at the end of a runway at Princess Juliana International Airport. Yes, a beach at the end of a runway. The runway itself is around 7,100 feet in length. To reach it, planes must make their approach at a low altitude over the water, so common in fact that planes appear to fly just a matter of feet above the heads of the public, which makes this beach one of the go-to places for adrenaline junkies. You see many Instagrammers travel to the beach just to experience the thrill of a jet blast up close, which sends them flying all over the beach. Unsurprisingly, some have died because of the strength of these jet blasts. Hence, our advice is clear: stay away from jet blasts. Although that seems like common sense, Maho Public Beach is frankly an insane creation. Whoever would have thought a beach next to a runway would be a good idea? Frankly, there haven't been more deaths. Number 9. A blinding light. It's kind of nuts to think that even the most gifted pilots in the world could land a plane with their eyes closed. But there may be some truth in it, at least for the Ukrainian pilot Alexander Akapov. Take a look at this. The plane, a Global Atlas aircraft, had fallen into the middle of a hailstorm so violent that it completely destroyed the front glass, autopilot, autotrack, and numerous other aspects of the plane. In any other situation, it would have seemed that this landing was doomed to fail. And yet, Akapov managed to land the aircraft safely, looking only through the closed side window. In effect, he had no tools to help him and had to trust only the tiny area he could see. Not your typical day in the office. The incident could have quickly gone horrifically wrong had the plane been guided by a more unprepared or inexperienced pilot. I don't think I have to explain that absolutely nobody was injured in the incredible miracle you just saw. All 121 passengers and the 6 crew members survived with absolutely no injuries. An astonishing achievement. Number 8. British Airways Flight 5390. Explosive decompression is an infrequent occurrence on modern flights. However, it's still something that understandably freaks out many people due to the fear of being forcibly ripped out of a plane. The anxiety is justified, as the fuselage unexpectedly separating from its own frame could result in a passenger being sucked into the engine, potentially bringing down the plane. While this is a rare occurrence, it has happened before, such as in 1990 when British Airways Flight 5390 suffered this unfortunate fate. Shortly after takeoff, a poorly installed windscreen came loose, pulling Captain Tim Lancaster halfway out of the plane. His coworkers initially thought he was dead, as his body went limp and his head kept hitting the side of the aircraft. Their fear was not for their colleague, but for what could happen if his body hit the engine. It's safe to say that Lancaster probably didn't appreciate hearing that. Against all odds, the plane managed to make an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. Number 7. Aircraft carrier landing. Even though it's something we've seen hundreds of times in TV and movies, we don't stop to think how crazy it is. It's like you're on an aircraft carrier and have to launch yourself at top speed off the edge. That's madness, and landing is even crazier. Look at these planes coming in for a landing. The pilots have to line up their landing gear just right, and there's also a whole crew of people responsible for preventing these aircraft from flying headfirst into the ocean. They do that with simple analog technology, a big-ass rope. When the plane comes to land, it inevitably passes straight into the cable, which then slows them down and eventually brings them to a complete stop. It's like when you leave the bar on a Friday night, wholly hammered. The bouncer pushes your chest and says, "Yo, what did you say to me?" Unless you're a pilot who does this stuff for a living, I don't think this will ever be normal. It's absolutely insane to think about a plane traveling hundreds of miles per hour having to land on a tiny strip of land or plummet into the ocean. Number 6. Heavy rain in Mali. Generally speaking, landing a plane during a heavy rainstorm is never a great idea, but this one takes it to a new extreme. We're about to show you actual footage of a Boeing 767 attempting to land in what has to be one of the most extreme rain conditions you could ever imagine. We cannot describe what happens in this video, as most of it is obscured by the heaviest rain clouds. Still, in a way, that's kind of all we have to say. Right, this storm was so intense and powerful that the pilots were basically flying blind. There was just no way for them to see what was ahead, let alone what was down below. No matter how hard the window wipers worked, it just doesn't let up. And then, out of nowhere, the runway finally appears. The plane somehow manages a safe landing. This is insane. That's basically the only word for it. To even attempt to fly an aircraft in these conditions is madness, but to successfully land is a gift from God. Number 5. Heavy Sydney storm. Everybody knows that Australia gets some pretty intense storms from time to time, but this one is a cut above the rest. This one isn't just dangerous, it's barf-inducing. Actually, I guess that is dangerous in certain situations. Immediately, you can see the danger in the video. These thick clouds are so dark that you can't even see through them. The rain is so intense and heavy that the windows have a constant stream of water. The turbulence, oh boy! All of this occurred during one of the most intense storms Sydney had seen in years, leading to one of the rockiest and most turbulent landings you could imagine. As the plane approached the runway, the wings started violently rocking up and down as if it was a circus ride. I can't even begin to think about how many people got nauseous during this come-down. Thankfully, the plane managed to land in one piece, although it's pretty clear that nobody had a good time doing so. This looks like one of the worst and most brutal landings ever seen in Sydney. Number 4. The A10 Thunderbolt II. We're going to take a slight detour now from commercial airliners into the more action-packed world of fighter jets, specifically the A10 Thunderbolt II. This aircraft managed to land in a problematic, Mission Impossible situation, and that is not an overstatement, in 1991. Captain Paul P.J. Johnson piloted the Thunderbolt during Operation Desert Storm, but then his plane was hit by a missile, creating a massive hole in the wing. So, there we have the basic situation. A fighter jet plane has a hole in its wing and is fired at by enemy combatants. What happens next is the plane lands. Seriously, Johnson was kind of the Ethan Hunt of his squad, capable of pulling off near impossible feats of survival and living to tell the tale. What a guy! Johnson would later earn the Air Force Cross for rescuing a stranded Navy pilot, which seems almost quaint by comparison. The Thunderbolt is an impressive, nearly indestructible piece of machinery, but only if it's piloted by someone who knows what the hell they're doing. And by that, I obviously mean somebody other than me. Number 3. Landing in the mountains. Okay, a little misleading. Landing in the mountains would not just be a dangerous plane landing. it would be a catastrophic and tragic one. Actually, we're just talking about landing among the hills, which is pretty nuts, especially when dealing with the most dangerous runway approach in the world. Bhutan's Paro Airport has what is widely considered to be the world's most hazardous runway approach. The airport is sandwiched between two mountains and valleys and sits at an impressive 7,300 feet above sea level. Yup, buckle up. This one is going to be crazy. I mean, when your pilot literally prays while heading for the runway, you know you're in some dangerous territory. Thankfully, only experienced pilots are allowed to make this landing due to the complicated maneuvers required. By that, I mean they have to brake fast. Paro Airport is really a daredevil's fantasy, a death wish masquerading as an ordinary runway. I'm trying to say that you couldn't get me on that plane if you had all the money in the world to offer. If my pilot is praying mid-air for a miracle, I'm out. Number 2. A Toronto snowstorm. A snowstorm can be a beautiful thing to witness if you're staying in one place for the foreseeable future. But if you're unlucky enough to be traveling anywhere, it can be one of the most horrific things you'll ever experience. Take these poor people, for example, who were headed for Toronto in an intense snowstorm. The storm was so fierce that the pilots could barely see ahead of them. Not something that any of us would want to experience. As you can see from the nose cam footage, the runway isn't even visible until extremely close, requiring an extremely talented pilot to navigate such an intense situation. Thankfully, Toronto pilots are phenomenal at their jobs. The plane was able to land successfully, albeit with some poor brakes. It turns out that brakes and ice don't go together. Who knew snowstorms were not new to Toronto? Many pilots have been forced to weather this kind of situation. If you're scared of flying, it's probably not fun. Number 1. One-wing landing. If you can believe it, landing a plane with one wing is possible. I mean, it's not ideal, but it's possible. In 1983, two Israeli Air Force aircraft collided in mid-air. One of them, the F-15, somehow managed to go on despite missing its right wing. Even more impressively, it landed successfully. I know, so if you're wondering how exactly the F-15 Eagle was able to land without an attachment, allow me to answer your query. The F-15 has a body that itself produces lift, also known as a lifting body. That, combined with its powerful engine thrusters, basically help the pilot to fly without the need for a second wing. Or, to put it simply, the wing was just an accessory. Without its wings, the F-15 basically worked as a kind of rocket, which is even more impressive because the pilot didn't know anything about space travel. That could have been a catastrophic landing. Landing with one wing is dangerous enough, but sending a pilot to space? They're sending Tom Cruise to play, so the bar has been lowered quite a bit. Have you ever been in a dangerous plane landing? Let us know in the comments.